Everyone. Welcome to the second day of our 10th annual conference at the Juris Rabinowitz Center for Public Policy and Finance here at Princeton. Today we have a great lineup of speaker and panelists. We will start with our keynote speaker, Mariana Mazzucato, and that will be followed by two panels. The first panel will be on the question of investment. Why has investment in the US economy been so low, both on the private and the public side, and what can be done to raise investment and hence growth? That's going to be the panel following the keynote. And then our second panel is going to be on the question of what can we do to make growth more equitable. So the big questions of structural change regarding the US economy, that's going to be the focus of the day here. I'm very pleased to introduce our first keynote speaker, Mariana Mazzucato. Mariana is a professor in the economics of innovation and public value at University College London. And she's also the founding director of the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose. She is the recipient of multiple international prizes, including most recently the 2020 John von Neumann Award, and before that, the 2019 All European Academies Madame de Staël Prize for Cultural Values. Before that, she got the Leontief Prize for advancing the frontiers of economic thought. She has also been named as one of the 3 most important thinkers about innovation and one of the 50 most creative people in business in 2020. We are very pleased to have Mariana amongst us. One other reason is that she recently has written a wonderful book called Mission Economy, a Moonshot Guide to Changing Capitalism. This was released this year. And as you can see from the title of this book, Mariana talks about the broader questions of how to improve the global economic system, what faults it might currently have, and how we can best go about improving the trajectory of the global economy in a way that benefits everyone. And I think that theme of Mariana's work is something that we appreciate a lot, and we are delighted, given that that is closely related to the theme of our conference, we are delighted that Mariana could join us as our keynote speaker. The timeline of the keynote speech is going to be, she's going to present her thoughts in the beginning for about 30 minutes. And after that, we are going to open up for a Q&A session with Mariana. So during her remarks, if you have any questions, please feel free to use the Q&A chat box to type in your questions, and then I will relay those questions to Mariana for a follow-up conversation. So without further ado, Mariana, again, great to have you, please. Oh, one thing I forgot, I should have mentioned this. Mariana, even though she's joining us virtually, she is actually a native of Princeton. She grew up in the town of Princeton and went to high school here. So this is a coming back home of sorts, and that makes it extra special. So Mariana, welcome again.
Thank you. I didn't just go to high school. I went to nursery school, elementary school, middle school, high school, played all the sports imaginable, which, by the way, is a great feature of, I don't know how it is now, but the public school system in Princeton was fantastic. You know, great jazz teachers, sports activities afterwards, all for free, something that now we forget, at least in this part of the world where I'm speaking. Anyway, so thank you so much for the introduction. It's a real honor. I wish this wasn't via Zoom, so I could also be visiting my family, my father, in Princeton. So I promise I will actually show up soon as this, terrible crisis is over that we're all living through. So thanks for the introduction. And what I want to do is actually in some way set things up so your next 2 panels have kind of the carpet laid out, because a lot of what I will be talking about is how do we catalyze investment into the economy? How do we make sure that that investment isn't just extracted out, which often it is, but reinvested and towards goals that we have? There's these amazing 17 sustainable development goals that the whole world has signed up to. And, the honest truth is we're simply not moving fast enough to confront them. And also the question of how do we direct growth to be not only sustainable, so, solving some of the biggest crises that we have right now, which is climate change, which I'll get to again in just a minute, but also make sure it's inclusive. So we're not just sharing the risks to make great things happen, but also the rewards. And the book, has just come out in the UK, about a couple of weeks ago, and it'll be coming out in the United States at the end of March. So this is a great platform to kind of preempt the aperitivo to the US edition. And so, we're all living through this tragic moment. It's not just a health crisis, it's all sorts of different crises in one. The people that are being affected by this crisis have often, or are the people who have also been very badly affected by the way we've organized capitalism. If you're a gig economy worker, if you're a frontline worker in the kind of public health service, which has been underfinanced and under-resourced, you are hurting more than ever. And the fact that all these different things had to happen, like the test and trace system, the vaccine, we need the PPE, again, for the frontline workers, the personal protection equipment, so that they're actually protected, especially because they are the essential workers helping us all while we're locked down at home. And we have done such a bad job globally in doing this, really, I think should just be a moment for pause. What are the lessons from this failure to organize ourselves collectively in order to also prepare us pre-crisis, but also during the crisis and post-crisis, in order to do what Biden and others call building back better. There's all sorts of lessons. I'm going to come back to those in just a minute, but this really is a fundamental moment for us to be rethinking how to do capitalism differently. And of course, this particular crisis, which is a health pandemic, is on top of multiple other crises that were there before. So the February before last March, when COVID became a household word, we weren't looking at frontline workers in hospitals on the news. We were looking at firefighters in California, or flood workers in Venice, which is the part of Italy that I'm from. And unfortunately, the problem with climate change is, again, not only is it often denied, and that's a whole other problem, which I think is actually related to how we think about information today. But really, one of the biggest problems is that we just have not been moving fast enough. The IPCC report told us we had 10 years left before climate breakdown was irreversible. And yet in 2019 in Europe, which is again where I'm standing right now, we gave $55 billion in subsidies to fossil fuel companies. That was just last year. And with the COVID-19 recovery funding, 56% of it across the G20 countries has actually gone to fossil fuel projects. So, this is a big alarm bell in terms of we are simply not moving even close to fast enough. And of course, there's all sorts of other challenges, including the economic crisis, not just as an outcome of COVID, but so many different countries have simply not recovered from the last financial crisis. And in some ways, we've been fueling the next financial crisis. So both in the US and in the UK, the level of private debt, not public debt, which everyone talks about, private debt to GDP is again at very, very high and unsustainable levels. And somehow it's kind of missing from the front pages of the newspapers. And why should it be on the front pages of the newspapers? Well, that's what caused the financial crisis. So, this is not good. And how we think about these problems, what I argue is we need to really go to the source. We need to better understand how we can do things differently. We can't just look at the symptoms, right? The different types of symptoms through the different multiple types of crises that we are going through. And what I'll do for most of this talk, and I do have a timer here, which tells me I have 25 minutes left. What I'll do for most of the talk is to talk about a framework through which to actually really build back much, much better, not just better. But first, just to make sure we're on the same page of why we need to change the way we do capitalism, I want to go through just some kind of very quick facts, of which both are actually related to your next panels. The first one is what we've been seeing happening in the financial sector. Unfortunately, for the last 30 or 40 years, what we've seen is that to a large extent, finance as part of, a fundamental part of capitalist economies has been financing itself. Other parts of the financial system, the acronym is FIRE, finance, insurance, and real estate. In the UK, again, where I'm standing today, something like only 20% of finance goes into the real economy. 80% of it goes back into these FIRE areas. And you also see this, if you, again, look back at the causes of the financial crisis, this financialization of the economy, which is putting people into ever greater debt, often because real wages aren't increasing, so they have to take out debt in order to retain their existing living standards, is in fact what is also fueling the different types of housing bubbles around the world. And so lots of mortgage credit, again, a system driven by private finance, then fueling different types of financial bubbles. And this is something that many people have written about. I focused on this in my previous book, The Value of Everything. But this is one big dysfunctionality of our system in terms of how we've allowed finance to basically just finance itself. And business itself, unfortunately, has become financialized. So it's not only that not enough finance goes to the real economy, but the real economy itself has become financialized. And you can see this in different ways. I mean, the kind of big stark point here in this graph is just how much of net income has gone back into just buying back shares. So the S&P 500 companies have spent over $4 trillion dollars worth in share buybacks. And this is basically a lack of, again, investment, what your next panel will be looking at, just to buy back shares, to boost stock prices, stock options, and executive pay. And you see this, by the way, when you look at GDP. Don't forget that GDP can be broken down into different ways. And many people say that GDP needs all sorts of improvement. It's true. But even with the existing way that we calculate GDP, you can see this dysfunctionality show up. So you can see that, for example, the business investment part of GDP, remember there's consumption, business investment, government investment, and net exports. The I bit, right, C plus I plus G plus X minus M, has been falling on trend in many different countries globally because this money is not going back in. And this is why in places like the World Economic Forum, there's been lots of discussion in recent years about the need to change how corporate governance works away from purely maximizing shareholder value to doing something that sounds a lot better, which is maximizing stakeholder value, actually reinvesting funds back into all sorts of different areas that can benefit people, planet, and community. But again, as with the point of climate change, we are simply not seeing change quick enough. In fact, some companies like Apple that didn't used to do massive share buybacks have gone on, very large share buyback charades in recent in the recent decade. So that really is the second problem. The first being, again, the dysfunctionality of finance, business itself becoming financialized. And the third problem I wanted to highlight before I go into the more interesting part of the talk in terms of the positive story is that governments themselves are stuck, right? It's not just finance and business, governments are stuck. And part of this is because they've bought into, government organizations, public organizations have bought into the idea that at best what they're there for is to fix market failures. So it basically sets you up as always being kind of too little too late, because you have to, by definition, wait for the market to fail in order to do anything. And this kind of bandaging up the system would be sort of okay if the system was fine and you were incrementally making sure it was doing a bit better now and then. But if we're trying to transform that system towards reaching really important targets around sustainability and inclusion, but also definancialization and really kickstarting massive investment into the economy to solve big problems that we are currently undergoing around health and climate, you can't just bandage things up. And it's not that these market failures don't exist. I think the framework is actually quite useful, but the fact that really important things like public goods are even seen as just correcting for a problem around positive externalities means that something that should be a great thing to talk about ends up just being a correction and not an objective, right? An objective would be maybe more what we sometimes call the common good. But the fact that, carbon taxes are seen as fixing the negative externalities, funding basic research, fixing positive externalities, helping SMEs, fixing information failures, just the framing itself ends up leading to problematic structures, which are by definition there to kind of fix problems when they arise, as opposed to actively shape and co-create a different type of economy. And what's interesting, and this is quite recent, at least here in the UK, there was a Tory lord who, when he saw just how, in some ways, powerless the government was with some of the challenges it was facing, both around Brexit, but also the COVID crisis and getting, again, enough personal protection equipment to frontline workers to get the test and trace system work and so on. He then looked at just how much government had been outsourcing itself, its brain, to consulting companies, and argued something that I've been actually arguing for almost 10 years, that this leads to a very problematic type of public sector. And he said it has infantilized the public sector. The fact that we are outsourcing to the private sector really key parts of what government should be for is making it more and more stupid. And therefore, it's also a self-fulfilling and kind of vicious cycle where, because you lack the capacity, because you're not investing in-house, you then need more and more others to do your job. And this isn't about saying the state should do everything. Of course not. Of course, you need to partner with all sorts of different organizations in the economy. But if you yourself are no longer a dynamic organization with dynamic capabilities, then it's going to be very hard also to partner with other actors. And I think, as I was saying, that this is an outcome of that third problem, which is that government itself isn't structured properly. It's not just business that needs to rethink its corporate governance. Government has to rethink its governance, away from one of just fixing markets towards one of actually actively co-creating and co-shaping. And one of the parts of the book, which I don't really have time because I want to get to the kind of key thesis, is I look at why this is, the kind of deep assumptions, problematic assumptions that we have in terms of how wealth creation itself occurs. And I look at 5 different myths, those around value, this idea that it's only businesses that create value and take risks, and the point of government is then to facilitate and at best enable that process, but not see its own role as actively taking risks. 2 books ago, I wrote a book called The Entrepreneurial State about this, looking at all the different technologies that make our iPhones and smart products smart and not stupid. They actually all trace their research back to some sort of public funding, which was also risk-taking, right? The internet, GPS, touchscreen, and Siri, all these technologies that make our smart products smart, came out of risk-taking government investments. For every internet, there's many failures. For every GPS, there's many failures. So it's not just about de-risking, but actively taking risks. Similarly, as I've already mentioned, this idea that markets are somehow out there, they sometimes go wrong, the point of government is to fix them, misses a key a reality. At least I think it's a reality. We should not forget that economics is a social science. So, this is all, I guess, a bit subjective. Markets themselves, I believe, are outcomes of how we govern all the different value creating organizations, whether it's government organizations, business organizations, trade unions, and civil society, and also how they interact one with another. So markets are actually outcomes of these governance and relational decisions. So it's not just out there to be fixed, it's an outcome. And that means we shouldn't just be asking, where's the market failure, but really, what are the types of markets that we require and what are the different types of co-shaping and co-creating activities. Just really quickly, also these different assumptions and myths around efficiencies, that the idea that government needs to be run like a business led to this whole kind of area within economics and actually management called public choice theory and new public management, which has basically convinced many public organizations to be run like a business. And this is related to the next point, which is that this then leads exactly to that kind of outsourcing idea that we need to then outsource things to the business community because they are more efficient, and make sure that government is just doing its small kind of market fixing exercise and leave the rest to the wealth creating businesses. This is itself related both to the outsourcing and to the lack of capabilities and dynamism and knowledge creating investments made within government institutions. And lastly, this idea that government should level the playing field, right? Kind of dismisses the whole point that actually, if we want to reach some goals like inclusive and sustainable growth, then we're going to have to talk about tilting the playing field, not leveling the playing field in the direction that helps us actually achieve a particular type of growth. So growth doesn't just have a rate, but a direction. And even deregulation puts growth in a particular direction. It always has a direction, but we tend to speak much more about the rate of growth, less about the direction. And as soon as we start admitting that we want a particular directed growth, the question is, well, what are the tools to make that happen if then the ideology and all the myths there have been about, that government shouldn't actually set directions, just facilitate and then let the market and business kind of, decide in which way we go. And so what I do in the book is to say, look, had we bought into all those assumptions, if we just allowed the economy to kind of, develop in such a way that we think that the market exists and we just fix problems as they happen, we simply would never have, done some of the most interesting things actually that humanity has done in the last 200 years, including this incredible feat that humans did 50 years ago, which was to get to the moon and back in one generation. And so what I do in the book is I backtrack and look at what it meant to really collaborate, invest, put purpose at the center of public-private relationships when we got to the moon. And what would it look like if we said, that we need that equivalent amount of leadership, of risk-taking and innovation, agility and flexibility within both government and private institutions, the welcoming of all the different spillovers that happen along the way. These are all things I'm going to go over in just a minute. Not worried so much about where's the money going to come from, but worried about the outcomes and doing the budgeting afterwards, what I call outcomes-based budgeting, and to really formulate, and this perhaps is the most important point today, given the challenge that we're facing with COVID, partnerships. So public, private, third sector partnerships with purpose at the center. So instead of just thinking of purpose in this kind of stakeholder value, Davos kind of way that at best it's about how business needs to change, what does it mean to put purpose at the center of how we, again, do capitalism and how the relationships between all the different collective value creating institutions, how they organize themselves. And this doesn't just happen because you wake up and decide to be purposeful. I'll argue it happens when the contracts themselves actually put that as a condition. So first of all, again, this is a very kind of brief whirlwind tour, some of the key points in the book. What's really extraordinary is that when Kennedy gave his speech in 1962 in Rice Stadium, they had no idea how to get to the moon. And yet he said, we're going to get there and back in one generation. There was all sorts of different ways. They kind of plotted out how it might happen. They ended up doing the lunar orbit rendezvous method. But when he said, we're doing this because it's hard, not because it's easy, he was serious in the sense that it was extremely difficult and they didn't necessarily have the knowledge and the capacity and the technology within government to know kind of ex ante what they were doing. Furthermore, the organization of government and NASA in particular, but really you could break this down in terms of all sorts of departments, wasn't structured in such a way to be bold and purpose oriented. There was very siloed types of communication between the different departments, very vertical. Communication was not flowing, it wasn't flexible and agile. And any person who's listening in, who's talked to policymakers and civil servants globally will know that this is often a complaint about departments all working within their little silos. And what was striking was that Gus Grissom, one of the 3 astronauts who died in the Apollo 1 fire on January 27th, 1967, before it blew up, he said, Jesus Christ, how the hell are we going to get to the moon if we can't even talk between 2 or 3 buildings within NASA? And so what that led to was lots of rethinking of the organization of government within NASA, led by someone called George Mueller, who I talk about in the book, who really thought about this issue, which in some ways is always talked about in businesses and in business schools and MBAs, because business is seen as a value creator. Then all these different issues around strategic management, decision sciences, organizational behavior is confronted head on. And when government isn't seen as an active value co-creator, is at best a market fixer and an enabler, a de-risker of risk happening elsewhere, then these important decisions about how you rejuvenate government institutions, instead of just assume that the word bureaucracy has to be a bad word. We all use the word bureaucratic to mean some Kafkian, monster of a bureaucratic process, but there's no reason that the word bureaucratic has to be negative, right? Because there's different types of bureaucracies. We simply don't have the right kinds of bureaucracies. They're too inertial, too vertical, too siloed. But it's very hard to change that if we don't believe that government is important in terms of being an active co-creator and shaper of markets and of value. The other thing that was really extraordinary is this, this did not just happen through government. It was not just NASA. It was not just aeronautics. There was huge amounts of collaboration across the whole economy. There was sectors like nutrition, materials, electronics, the whole software industry, one could argue, was a spillover of this, of the Apollo mission. And NASA was very careful, actually, when it was collaborating, as anything, requires collaboration between different actors. When it was collaborating, it made sure to actually design the contracts, the procurement contracts, or the grants and the loans. The loans would be more today if we're looking at, say, climate change investments, but definitely the procurement contracts and the grants to foster as much bottom-up innovation through the different types of businesses that were getting involved, but it was very goal-oriented. It wasn't like, oh, let's be business friendly and bring business into the sector because that in itself is somehow good and it's an end in itself. It was, no, we have a problem to solve and we need business to help us do it. But here's the outcome that we require. Design the procurement process to crowd in as many different solutions. How it's done is up to business. You don't want to micromanage that process, but it was for a particular end goal. And they also changed how they were doing procurement away from cost price models where the costs were simply kind of fed to NASA and they had to reimburse plus give a particular fee, to fixed price ones with particular types of incentives. So they thought about the advantage and disadvantage of different types of contracts that would make sure that there was as much incentive to innovate, but also that they weren't going to be taken for a ride. And they even had something that was incredible, which I hadn't realized until I started researching this. They had things like no excess profits clauses, which is, I think, quite interesting today, where we're seeing, also trillionaires come about from the climate crisis. And this is, again, something we might come back to in the Q&A session. But the idea that this shouldn't just itself also become a gambling casino, but a real kind of purpose-driven partnership where profits, of course, are allowed, but not in excess, right? Because you want to be sure that the profits, the growth that actually comes about by such a dynamic mission is also shared more equitably amongst all the different value creators and not just getting privatized. And another thing that I found really interesting was that the head of procurement, I think his name was Ernest Brackett, said, we have to also be aware of brochuremanship. They didn't have PowerPoints back then like I'm using now, but I would argue that today he'd say, beware of those sexy PowerPoints that actually have nothing behind them. In other words, we need, he was saying in NASA, to have our own capabilities to even understand what it is we're trying to do with the private sector. Otherwise, we're just going to be kind of wooed by sort of, sexy brochuremanship, he called it. And this, coming back to that point about the infantilization of governments that allow themselves to outsource their brains, I think that's a big warning sign. But also all the amazing spillovers that happened along the way, the serendipitous form that so many different innovations actually take across different sectors, where lots of the interesting things happen along the way to trying to do something else. Viagra itself was not meant to do what it does today. It was meant to be for the heart. Something else goes up. This is actually very typical of innovation and all these different spillovers and 20 things we wouldn't have without space travel. There's many more than that, but that's quite a typical result of when you have a mission-oriented goal with lots of different sectors taking part. And one of the issues that this presents is when you then evaluate your mission, how well did you do? If you're just evaluating it in terms of cost-benefit analysis or net present value, we're not actually able to capture these dynamic spillovers. And this is extremely important actually for any form of public investment. The money they spent, yes, at the time seemed very large, but as Kennedy himself said, all this will cost us, yes, a lot of money. We might even screw up along the way. He was very serious about that, honest about it. But he said, in the end, this is actually less than we pay for cigarettes and cigars every year. This itself is quite important, where today we focus so much on the deficit, in debt, and forget that so much of this is actually about how we structure that investment. The fact that this particular investment fostered so much investment in innovation across multiple sectors is what actually then stimulated lots of the growth that came from that, not just in terms of the spillovers in those different areas I mentioned, but also in terms of debt to GDP. We saw this, by the way, also after the by debt to GDP, I mean, if you're fostering both private and public investment, the focus of your next panel, that around areas that can also increase productivity growth, then the denominator of debt to GDP is growing, which actually keeps your debt to GDP in check. So this difference between focusing just on the deficit versus on long run drivers of growth is something that somehow gets missed often in discussions about public deficits. And I only have about 5 minutes left, so I'm going to go through this bit a bit quickly. But really, what I've just talked about is the core thesis of the book, which is that we need to think differently. We need to admit that value is created collectively from not just from business, but also different types of actors in the public sector and the third sector. And none of the big challenges that we have that are underneath these 17 Sustainable Development Goals, which I repeat, we've all signed up to. So if we're serious, what are we going to do about it? None of these will be solved by one actor alone, business, government, or philanthropies. We need to start learning how to collaborate in different ways. And there's so many interesting lessons from the moon landing, which, however, should not be cut and pasted, right? That was mainly a technological feat. These Sustainable Development Goals are what one calls wicked challenges. They require lots of social, regulatory, political change. And my colleague, Dick Nelson at Columbia University, wrote a fantastic book back in 1977, The Moon and the Ghetto, precisely thinking about this problem also, which Ralph Abernathy at the time of the moon landing talked about, which is how can we go to the moon and still have ghettos, still have such structural inequality? And I think the answer is both that we're not putting enough urgency and importance to these social problems, but also we haven't figured out how to really confront both the political, the technological, the social, and behavioral within this, a mission-oriented strategy. So often that can lead to kind of technocentric and deterministic approaches to social problems that require much more ambitious thinking. But what I want to do now is really just literally in the last 4 minutes, give you a bit of insight of what I've been doing globally with different governments for the last 5 years and why I wrote the book, which is what does it actually look like to bring this kind of moonshot and mission-oriented perspective to the concrete stuff that governments do every day, whether that's procurement policy, so government as purchaser, whether it's how do you devise an industrial strategy to make America great again, or build back better, as Biden calls it, or innovation policy. And the key lesson is you begin with the challenge. What are the challenges? What is the discussion in a country about the direction of growth we want to move into? And here I really want to argue again, for the third time, let's not rethink this too much. These are the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, but we need to transform them. They need to land in local places, whether it's cities, regions, nations, in such a way that the different institutions can really co-design and think together about how to transform them into concrete missions that are targeted and that really require all sorts of different sectors, whether we're looking at the future of mobility, healthy aging, a plastic-free ocean, a carbon-neutral city. Lots of different sectors could actually get involved in that. This isn't about one sector like renewable energy for green. It wasn't just aeronautics for going to the moon. And then those circles on the bottom are really about the design challenge. How can we then take this approach and say we need to do things differently? It's not just about handing out money, whether it's to SMEs or particular sectors or particular technologies, but redesigning the tools of public policy like procurement and industrial strategy to crowd in, bottom up, lots of different innovations, experimentation by multiple actors that are headed towards that particular goal. So these are just two quick examples, which I wrote about in a report I wrote for the European Commission, on the back of which the European Commission actually voted through the Parliament and the Council, European Council, for this new missions concept, which I was advocating for to become part of the 80 billion euro Horizon program. And this is just kind of showing what it would look like, for example, with clean oceans, where all sorts of sectors like AI, chemicals, biotech, design, waste, et cetera, would innovate. But that would occur again through a mission-oriented policy, which would have this kind of objective of crowding in multiple bottom-up solutions, which, if you are an SME, a small medium enterprise, will need extra support, but you're not getting the support because you're a small company. But this requires a picking the willing, not picking the winners mentality of government policy itself. In the second report, I went into all the difficult things that actually this means in terms of, again, the capabilities that you need within government, how to organize finance so it crowds in other forms of finance, but also this issue of evaluation that I talked about. But missions have to be bold, inspirational, clear direction, get as many different sectors together to innovate and collaborate and drive those multiple bottom-up solutions. Sorry, this was the second report I was mentioning. This issue of evaluation, which I already mentioned before, is very important. I just did a report for the BBC with some colleagues where the BBC itself is often evaluated in terms of public value, and yet, because it gets a television license fee from citizens, and yet the Treasury here, and I think this is true globally, has no real idea how to evaluate such an ambitious agency like the BBC, which has never accepted its role as just fixing a market failure. They've really transformed formats from soap operas to talk shows and crowded in business along the way, spurred lots of innovation. And yet if we just measure them as a market fixing institution through net present value and cost benefit analysis, it's very difficult. Let me just move on. One of the critiques that I get when I put forth this idea of a mission-oriented moonshot approach is, this is just about lots more money. And, it's not. It's about organizing public investment in order to really foster public-private collaborations in a new way, which should really create additionality, create spur business investment that wouldn't have happened otherwise. So it's really about making government smarter, not just bigger. A lot of money is wasted in public expenditure when it's simply just kind of helicopter money or throwing money out to problems thinking and hoping for the best without having this active strategic public investment, which kind of leads the way and crowds in private investment. It's not about picking winners. It's not about big projects, siloed projects. This is about choosing a direction and again, crowding in as many different projects, not embellishing one big project, kind of a monster in the desert. And it's also not about ideology. It's actually fundamentally, it's not the great leap forward. It's actually about really being able to bring this notion of stakeholder capitalism to the center of how we can do capitalism differently. Lastly, this crisis is one where not only have we needed lots of investment, whether it's, again, the personal protection equipment, the vaccine, the test and trace system, and collaboration, but we also need to govern these processes with the real concept of the common good that I mentioned before. And I think there's no place like health innovation that makes us realize this more. And it's really interesting how Dr. Tedros, who's the head of the World Health Organization, has talked about the need to govern the vaccine production from a public good and common good perspective. So having a people's vaccine would require making sure that patents are not abused, right? You have public and private sectors spending money on the vaccine, but if we then allow the patent system to work as business as usual, that leads to a lot of value extraction and not enough collective intelligence and not enough sharing of that intelligence globally. And it also can lead separately to what we're seeing today, which is a huge amount of hoarding of vaccine dosages. So his point that we can't have vaccine apartheid, both these points of collective intelligence with intellectual property rights and making sure that we distribute the goods more equitably are very much need kind of a market shaping and a market co-creation perspective, because you can't just fix your way at the end towards achieving those needs around inclusion. They have to be nested within the agreements in the first place. And also we've seen this with the different types of bailouts globally. Some countries, like in France, this is a Minister of Finance of France, were quite bold in making sure there were strong conditions attached to the bailouts that particular companies like in airlines and automobiles got. So in France, they asked the companies that were receiving recovery funds to make sure that they'd be reducing their carbon emissions over the next years. They had to sign up to that. Whereas in other countries, we just gave out money. Like in the UK, we gave a huge bailout to EasyJet, one of our airlines, no conditions attached. So this kind of moonshot approach, of no excess profits, as NASA talked about, and the need for internal capabilities and the need to form purpose-driven partnerships. There's no moment like a crisis where this is also important to make sure that a crisis is not wasted. So huge amounts of money, 1.9 trillion in the US, close to $1 trillion in Europe, being plowed into the system. We need to make sure we govern those investments, the loans, the bailouts in such a way that we really are building back towards a more inclusive and sustainable economy. And in Denmark, by the way, no recovery funds for companies that use tax havens. That should not be rocket science. That's quite intuitive, but that only comes about if you think of yourself as co-creating and co-shaping a better economy. I'd have more to say on the digital commons. I don't think I have time. Why don't I just stop here and just end with this slide, which is the conclusion of the book, where I argue, similarly, where I said you had all these myths that are driving the wrong kind of practice and policy. When we rethink practice to be different in a more mission-oriented way, this really requires us to rethink value as collectively created, markets as needing to be co-created and not just fixed, and shaped, actively shaped. Organizations, all, not just in the private sector, require dynamic capabilities. Finance itself, budgets need to be outcomes-based. We need to think, what do we need to do, and work backwards and structure our budgets in such a way that make that happen. Distribution needs to be not just about post-distribution after we create wealth, but getting the right contracts from the beginning, kind of in a pre-distribution way that shares both risks and rewards. We need purpose and stakeholder value, not just to be about corporate governance, but at the center of partnerships. And that's why it's really about rethinking capitalism. So purpose at the center of how we co-create value. And also this issue of participation. This is something I didn't have much time to talk about, but who sets the missions? It shouldn't just be a minister or a pet project of someone. It really, ideally, especially with societal missions, should be an outcome of kind of co-design and bringing citizen engagement to the table. And if there's time in the Q&A, I can give examples of how that's being done in some parts of the world, like in Sweden, where they've thought about making school meals the objective of their missions, and bringing students and kids to the table to rethink school meals at the center of a carbon neutral agenda, and getting kids to take part of that and to also monitor along the way if it's working. So citizen engagement and participation is very important. So thank you. I have gone over time, so I will stop talking.
Thanks, Mariana. That was a terrific, by the way, trying to paint a picture on such a broad canvas, but you did that brilliantly. As you can imagine, given the scope of your conversation, there are many questions. I will try to channel some of them to you. I'm going to start with the point that you started with, which is talk about you talked about the 5 myths, and as you went through those 5 myths, I think it's fair to say that there is a shared, broader kind of appreciation of those myths. I think there's a increasing understanding around the world that we have kind of perhaps misdiagnosed a bit how the economy should be structured. And so, as I said, there's a lot of support for your view. What I wanted to get to in a bit more detail is why those myths got created, and can we learn something from the creation of those myths? Because it's important that we understand the process that led to those myths, and is there something to learn from that? And I want to ask that question particularly from the perspective of the interaction between political economy, of how ideologies, worldviews get formed, the politics of that, and its interaction with academia, where many of us belong, right? For all of the myths that you mentioned, I'm sure we can think of names and big names who were behind them and who were pushing those ideas, so on. And then those ideas got, or maybe captured by the politics of it. So how can we avoid forming new myths and have a more objective understanding of where we are and what needs to be done? That's the question.
That's a great question. I don't think we can avoid this, right? I mean, I mentioned already that economics is a social science, so we can't pretend it's like nuclear physics, that there's some sort of hard realities and truths out there. This really is about debating how we understand the world we live in. And when I called them myths, I'm really saying I don't believe in these myths, but you can find someone else who would say that, again, what I believe is a myth. So the first thing is just to say this is incredibly contested as a terrain, and we should admit, when we admit that economics is a social science, that's when we start also to realize, for example, why lots of the maths that have been used in economics, the problem is not the maths itself, is what kind of maths was used. So, Newtonian physics used today, and, in calculus, in the way that we quantify economics. The real problem is that it is, perpetrating this idea that we have these unique equilibria, that in the end averages really matter, that any deviation from the average is some sort of temporary disequilibria towards, what eventually becomes more, a model that can actually be described by representative agents. Any sort of disequilibria is, again, a transient state towards an equilibria. So that requires a particular type of mathematics. And yet so much of the critique to economics in recent years, I think, unfortunately, has been saying there's too much maths, and not why is it actually that a particular type of math was used in order to prove ex ante what they wanted to prove in the first place, right? If you want to prove that capitalism is the best of all possible systems, and Pareto optimality is a great way to show that equilibrating system, then Newtonian physics is really useful. If you use instead, say, biology and biological mathematics from biology, for example, distance from mean dynamics, that gives you a very different description of the system itself, where if everyone looks like the mean, you actually can't even talk about growth. I've just kind of elaborated on that just to make sure that we always begin with, the admission that actually this is really about the choices that we're making, also in terms of the kinds of tools we're using to understand the system that surrounds us, and that there's a self-fulfilling prophecy. If we're choosing particular types of tools, often we do actually get particular types of results. But, let me just step back a bit from that. If you take Piketty's book, Thomas Piketty's book, which is basically a huge treatise, a wonderful treatise on inequality and how it's changed over time, a lot of the periods he looks at where inequality rose, that was accompanied by particular stories that were being told about where wealth creation was occurring. So you can't just kind of get better tax policy, for example, in order to fight inequality. You need to ask yourself, what are the stories or the myths that are being told to convince people that a particular type of tax policy is correct? And this is why actually my previous book, I began with this great quote by Plato, where he said, storytellers rule the world. So if you look back in the 1970s in the US, in just 5 years, capital gains tax fell by 50%. That was between 1976 and 1981. And it didn't just happen, like it wasn't just maybe wrong or right. It happened because there was huge amounts of lobbying being occurred by particular actors within the financial sector, arguing that that was a good thing to do. So the idea that somehow we just get changes and they sometimes cause inequality or cause things to go better without uncovering the stories that are being told, which then make those things happen, is I think, a big problem. And this idea that, again, government is just there to fix things and to at best de-risk the risk takers, that actually benefits hugely particular actors in the system. So if I just, again, look at health, the large pharmaceutical companies benefit hugely by pretending that they're the big innovators. They just need a bit of maybe basic science, invested by the government. But then, the real innovation and wealth creation has occurred by big pharma. And so the prices of drugs, if you uncover the theory of drug pricing and the value-based pricing model that we use to put prices on medicines, that has a particular theory of where value is coming from. So if we want a more equitable distribution of drugs, we better understand the stories that are being told and how they underlie these pricing formulas around value-based pricing, which basically assumes that prices should go to whatever the market can bear. And again, I don't have time now to go into the details of that, but I recommend anyone who's interested in looking at drug pricing and asking how can it be that in the US, $40 billion a year are spent by Uncle Sam, the National Institutes of Health, on drug innovation, and then we don't actually make sure that the prices of those drugs represent that collective value creation. And that's been, due to this mythological, if you want, idea of where that values come from in the first place.
Thanks. Let me get to your other main point, which is like the moon analogy, right? We need to set a new direction, as you said, and you are also very clear on not defining a project per se. Like we don't want to define, we want to build Concord or something that specific, but at the same time, it needs to be a direction that we want to set, and then work towards that direction through public and private partnerships. And so clearly you're not completely trying to kill markets or something like that extreme, obviously, and at the same time, you're trying to balance the markets with, as you were saying, direction. With more public investment, more kind of guidance from the public sector, if you will. Whenever you do something like that, you obviously have to design rules of the game under which this will be done. So let me take something concrete about which there's a lot of conversation now in the policy circles in the US. You know, everybody now with the new Biden administration talking about build back better. And while there may be some broader understanding of, you know, how many trillions we are talking about, there is a lot of detail, and a very important detail given your thesis, that hasn't been spelled out. So for example, when we talk about build back better, what should be the direction? Like, what's the new moon landing equivalent, if you will? So if I could put you on the spot and say, okay, if you were advising the Biden administration and they are all saying, look, we have the money, here is, I don't know, $3 trillion, let's put a number out there. What direction would you give, number one? And number two, if you could walk us through some of the details that you would give. So for example, and you mentioned this as well, you mentioned one example of going back in history, you know, you said, okay, no excess profit. That's very important, right? I mean, I could imagine you could have something like Build Back Better, set up like a public venture capital fund of sorts, but it can easily be captured by the private players and converted into high profits and not much real investment. You know, like, think of what has happened with the healthcare system in the US. Think of what has happened with infrastructure in New York City, for example, where you can spend billions of dollars and only, you know, a little piece of new rail comes out of it because it's just so inefficient. So there are some massive problems in the details of setting a public-private partnership. And at some level, the US experience has not been maybe that that promising. So again, just a bit more on the detail as consultant to the Biden administration.
Sure. And in fact, what I sort of cut out in order to stick to the time was some of the examples that my institute, the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose at UCL, has been working on with global leaders in different countries, including, by the way, in the Biscay region of Spain, where they have a whole history of the cooperative movement. So they're one of the largest cooperatives in the world. It's an industrial cooperative, not a retail one, called Mondragon, 87,000 workers. And what does it mean to bring this notion of, you know, cooperation and the cooperative kind of corporate governance structure to a transition for a whole region, right? A green transition, you know, can happen in all sorts of different ways. It can go wrong fundamentally, as you were talking about. And so if we actually structure the relationships between the different actors with already kind of a new social contract that can be driven by a cooperative model of interaction, that's, you know, can really benefit from actually looking at how cooperatives have worked globally. So we're not just kind of rethinking from scratch and pretending that this history doesn't exist. So my advice would be, you know, even though we do have all these, you know, SDGs and problems in all sorts of different areas, the climate crisis is a really good focusing device. So coming back to this idea that we need a green transition, a Green Deal, we need to first of all realize that that is more important than ever, both because the kind of, you know, health crisis that we're experiencing is not unlinked to how we are currently treating our planet and treating you know, people, animals, and planet. And so what would it look like to bring a Green Deal viewpoint at the center of a COVID recovery, right? Because the recovery is what's going to be in every leader's mind, including Biden, for the next at least year. And instead of just thinking about recovering, what does it mean to build back better by having a green vision at the center of unlocking the investment, right? $1.9 trillion of a Biden, you know, recovery plan. It can't just be about kind of filling the system with money, because by the way, that's what happened with the financial crisis. We had a huge recovery plan. Most of that money just went back into the financial sector, it didn't stick on the ground. So if we want, you know, a stronger healthcare system, if we want a stronger also public education system, because we want to prevent things like the digital divide, where all these kids are experiencing their human right now to education in such a different way because of the kind of extreme inequality we have, all these different targets, whether it's the digital divide or climate can actually be at the center of how we design the recovery itself. And this is critical, because we shouldn't forget that profits, I already mentioned this in the beginning, profits are not in any sort of problematic state. There's a record level in terms of the profit share of GDP. As I mentioned before, GDP can be broken down both in terms of demand, consumption, business investment, but also in terms of income, profits, wages, rents, and interest. The profit share is at a record level. The wage share is at a record low in terms of proportion of the GDP pie. So what does it mean when Biden says, I want to be a union man, instead of it just being a slogan, how can we create conditions right now in this recovery where businesses need support now, conditions for better working conditions, conditions for not using excessive share buybacks, conditions for reducing our carbon emissions at the center of how public and private relate. And what's interesting is, in a moment where all this public money is going into the system, where it literally has come out of thin air, because just a couple years ago, everyone was worried about the deficit and the debt, and all of a sudden it's magically coming out of the woodwork. What does it mean to make sure that the structure through which that money comes out in recovery and bailouts and so on, in the furlough schemes, that's what we call them here, where government is picking up 80% of the wage bill, even with that, how can you make sure that once the furlough scheme is up, companies don't just lay off the workers? That requires a condition in the contract. In the US, by the way, people forget that some of the best examples of private sector innovation often came out actually of conditionalities of that sort. So Bell Labs, which many people know about, there's a great book also about it. It was a key private sector R&D laboratory. It would not have happened had government not insisted with AT&T, which had a monopoly at the time, that its profits, in order to retain its monopoly status, the profits had to be reinvested back in the economy into innovation, and big innovation beyond telecoms. So Bell Labs was in some ways the answer to the provocation of the government to AT&T that its monopoly status wasn't kind of God-given, it was state-given, and they needed to give back. And so bringing, when we talk about the Green Deal, I think we focus a lot on the green and we forget about the deal. So the deal, meaning how, the contract literally between two parties and what they both get. I think this is the moment for, Biden's transition team, or now they're in government, but it's going to be a long transition actually towards getting the recovery, to experiment with different types of approaches in order to get a better deal. And you mentioned public venture capital funds. A venture capitalist would never just be willing to just take the downside without getting a share of the upside. So there's lots of really interesting discussions about how to set up public wealth funds or citizens dividends, citizen shares in this moment that we're exploring different types of public funds needed in the system. But that really is about looking just as much about the reward sharing mechanisms. And that, I think, really needs to be very ambitious, because what you mentioned about the US is very true, which is that there's been lots of public investment, but the rewards have often just been privatized. Just look at Silicon Valley, which I wrote about in the book Entrepreneurial State. Just look at the public school system there and just how bad it is. And that itself should kind of wake us up to, even if you help create wealth in a certain area, unless you structure how that wealth gets shared, it can all basically get extracted out. And it's not that the big tech companies aren't doing great things. Of course they are, but they didn't do it alone. So what we've allowed to happen with digital platforms, huge amounts of public investment in areas like the internet, and then we failed to govern how this technology is actually used. And it's, we're seeing today just how much it's also failing citizens. We get great things, we can search Google, but if we don't be careful of how Google searches us, that's also part of the kind of bad deal. So that's, I think, my biggest message to Biden would be focus on the Green Deal at the center of this health recovery, but focus as much on the deal bit as you are on the green bit. And that requires lots of experimentation on new ways to make sure we're really sharing the rewards as much as the risks.
Thanks, Mariana. We have gone a bit over time and we have to start the next panel in about 5 minutes, but I'll just, if you could just respond to this final question, some people have mentioned this in about a minute or two. Is the analogy to China, given what you're saying, and is it like some of the things that you're saying, it feels like China has kind of done some of that in the past to get to where they have gotten to? And so is that, how do you just, compare China's progress given kind of what you're recommending for like the US and other countries going forward? And again, we just have a minute or two, so if you could just.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, let's be clear. I'm not saying the US should do this. The US has done this. The US, the center of its kind of what really made it great, in terms of, being the key innovator in areas like ICT, this all came out of mission-driven investments. The whole software industry came out of a US government when it was really mission-driven, working together with the private sector. So it wasn't all state kind of done, but the state directed that particular, direction, and then fostered, as those examples that I give are ways that it thought concretely about how to crowd in kind of business sector investment. So that's the US model. The fact we haven't rendered it explicit, the fact we haven't replicated it today, the fact we're not applying it to our social problems is what I'm underlining. China is very much about a big state. It's very top down. There's particular sectors and infrastructure areas that they're investing in. They're not doing what I'm talking about in terms of these kind of ambitious goals that require all sorts of sectors to innovate together and really to redesign the concrete tools of government to crowd in and foster bottom-up innovation in business. So it's wrong. The reason I put this isn't about picking winners. It's not about just the big state. It's precisely to kind of preempt some of these critiques that it seems like, rightly so, people have as soon as you talk about the state waking up again. But we need to be careful because that itself is ideological, to think that as soon as someone talks about the state becoming more strategic, proactive, shaping, getting a good deal for citizens, this is about China. But it's a good question because we need to be careful, as you were saying yourself, that we don't just create another myth or another ideology. But for me, this is about public-private partnerships at the core, admitting that economic growth has a direction, not just have a rate. And also that last point I mentioned under participation when I had the new areas of political economy, how do we make sure that these areas and these directions really are an outcome also of bringing a more democratic kind of engagement of citizens. So we have, for example, citizen assemblies to talk about how we want to live together in a city instead of just having it fed top down from an academic, a business leader, or a minister saying we all need a carbon neutral city. So I think it's actually very different from what's happening in China, but it's very different also from what's happening today in the US.
Thanks. Mariana, we are over time, but thank you so much for your very insightful comments. It was a treat to have you, even though virtually, and we would love to have you back in person, back home in Princeton. So
thank you so much. I'm sorry I went over. Bye-bye.
No, you did. You're right on track.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Thanks.